Hi, and welcome to this week's episode of DDXtra, the bonus episode to differential diagnosis. As always, in this extra episode of the show, we try to step away from the chronological look through the entire series and instead try to differentially diagnose a certain interesting aspect of the show, be it fan fiction, characters, individual themes, or something else. Well, this week, to follow up our very long character analysis of the entire team, looking at their journey throughout season one, we thought we'd do the same for Gregory House, but instead give him an episode of his own. So this is a character analysis and sort of general chat about Gregory House, but only within the framework of season one, not throughout the entire show. We're going to try and keep all of these character analysis on a season-by-season basis to see, the character's own plot lines, developments throughout each season. My name's Harvey, and as always, my friend Gaz is here as well as your other co-host to Differential Diagnosis.
Oh, yes, thank you for that elongated introduction. Pleasure to be here as usual. Honoured to be presenting this episode with you on the titular character of this series, Dr. Gregory House.
Yeah, especially on the, what we have learned is the eve of 5 days past the 15th anniversary since the pilot aired on November the 16th, which somehow we missed.
Yeah, we did miss that, which was a shame. Otherwise, we would have brought it up in the earlier episode we did this Monday. Alas, you got to keep rolling.
No regrets.
No regrets. So Gregory House is a central character of this series. Without him, there is no House. It would just be MD, and it would just be like, medical degree? Why are we talking about a medical degree? It's just a wandering piece of paper making wisecrack jokes and smart aleck like declarations to his team. It would be very weird.
Well, even though it's a pretty, on the face of it, especially when it was made, it was a pretty standard medical procedural that was gonna I think the original focus, from what I've read, wasn't even going to be necessarily that focused on the characters as such. It was going to be a fun procedural drama, but as time went on, you can tell that the real strength of the show is not the mysteries. It's not even necessarily the additional characters, although they are fantastic. The real strength of the show, which really pushed it into the forefront, is Hugh Laurie as Gregory House. I mean, it's an iconic character for a reason. It's an extremely well-developed character with lots of minutiae and a real care put in by the actor to really bring that character to life. Because there's a lot of things on the face of House. He's a maverick. He's he's funny. He's a little bit wacky. He's a little bit kooky, possibly kookier as the show goes on. But there's a lot of depth there, and why I think it was a good idea that we left this Gregory have his entire. Why we let Gregory have an entire episode to himself is because there's so much there bubbling away under the surface, which is just seen in small glances, just small moments by himself. On the face of it, House can be quite an easy character to read. It's like, oh, he's a funny maverick, but if you really look into it and you have some degree of emotional intelligence, which I'm sure most of our listeners do, there really is a lot more going on there. He's not just funny and kooky and deflective because he enjoys it. He is a deeply unhappy man who is trying to hide a lot of things, and I think that's what really gives the character, and therefore the most of the show, its depth. Even though those moments only come out in small chunks, I think they have a lot of gravity to them when they do, and they really make the show stand out, rather than it just being a serialized, well, that was a fun mystery, let's see what's happening next week on the, as if it's like Scooby-Doo. But with a medical team.
And I think the interesting thing about House is he's not a static character. because there's a lot that's hidden from us as viewers, especially early on, about who he is and what he does. And a lot of questions about, well, why does he have the limp? How did he get the limp? Why is he so cantankerous? Is it because of the limp? Then you start delving into, is the limp a metaphor as much as it is an exploration of disability as well? All of these things get kind of bundled up. It's as though the character, through the writing, and this is what I think, you say the strength of the acting, I think that catches one aspect of why it's such a good character. The other part is that the character, when he comes into the world in the pilot, even though we might want to argue that the pilot's not very... It's not necessarily representative of the entire tone of the series, but what it does introduce is this kind of all of this meaning, all of this kind of how to put it, all of this kind of character development is all kind of compressed inside of House's character.
Yeah.
Things that he says, what he does, and how he interacts. Usually the payoffs for those things don't really come until way down the line. In a lot of cases, the pills get introduced, the loneliness gets introduced, and you kind of think to yourself, all these questions are slowly being unpacked. Why is he alone? He's quite an accomplished doctor. He's moody, yes, but a lot of people are moody in life, and they carry on and have happy relationships with people. And you have the hints about him like 5 years ago, and hints about change and not changing, in terms of his personality. And it all kind of just unfurls really nicely, really well. And I like that about it.
Yeah, I think you could easily have... I think a less confident show might have had episodes like Detox, where we find out about House's drug problem being like the second or third episode, or even brought up very plainly in the pilot. But the fact they're not, as you say, there's a lot of confidence in the strength of the character and what they have to show. The thing I don't know if you'd agree with this, but the thing I find quite interesting about House and why why it feels like there's so much to learn about him is it kind of feels like we meet House after there could have been a show about House, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
It's like House has been through the big traumatic event. The underlying thing is that it seems that House is, this quite miserable, cantankerous man. He's got a lot of things going on, and his life has seen a big shift in the last 5 years. And so it kind of feels like when we step into House's world that we've sort of stepped into the most interesting part of his story, where he's already been through lots of character development, not positive character development, but he's had a major change in his life. And so the entire sort of show is, hey, here's a character who's already changed. Like, this is a character that has basically been through his big moment. Here's how he copes with it. It's pretty much like the equivalent of, like, in the Lord of the Rings, where you see like Sam in the Shire getting married and having a family after. Like, his interesting story was the Lord of the Rings, when he took the ring to Mordor, right? The least interesting part of his life is actually just him living in the Shire, and that's kind of what House feels like. It feels like this is House in the Shire after the big event, and it's just sort of just quite dull and painful and miserable, and it's just sort of seeing how he copes with that. And obviously more things as they try and bring in the idea of, can House be a better person? Can he improve and get better? Which I think is brought in later seasons. The first season spends a lot of time like establishing why House is the way he is, and then there'll be a more positive spin on, can House be happy? But until then, it very much feels like House has already had his big moment, and this is just the aftermath of that.
But I mean, that would have... I don't know. I agree with that to an extent. The problem is that Yeah, it is after this massive life event. If you wanted to create a really interesting show, you would have made the pilot all about his just immediately after he's, had the leg operation, or just after he's had the rehabilitation for it, where he's kind of coming to terms with the movement issue,
Yeah.
the deterioration of that relationship with his girlfriend or partner, Stacy, and then his road back to this point where he can have like a diagnostics team, and that he's working at Princeton Plainsboro, for instance, again. And yeah, maybe that would have been a really compelling show, but it just would have felt so much more formulaic in a lot of ways. And probably not necessarily what NBC wanted at the time, which would have been
No, completely.
profoundly depressing
Oh, completely.
television. Um,
I, I think this is a much more interesting way of telling that story rather than it being like oh, he's had a bad event. Can he pull himself out of it? Let's see him like improve and get better. I do prefer here's the aftermath.
It would have turned into a complete 1980s montage thing, right? If the producers got their hands on it, and the execs kind of going, "Oh, we need to put a bit more of a positive spin on this." It just would have been a disaster. What I like about how David Shaw introduces character, apart from the compression, is that it kind of puts us into a false sense of security at an initial stage where you think you're dealing with it's House. Oh, that's a play on Holmes. He's Sherlock Holmes, but he's a doctor. And this is a medical procedural drama, but it's going to be a little bit more clever and intriguing from a kind of scientific point. You'll get the gore, and then you get the mystery, and then you get the revelation. And that will be the end of the show. And luckily it didn't do that. And it used it as a way to slowly unfurl a character by first proposing that he is deeply flawed. The pilot did that, albeit ham-fistedly, especially when you had Cameron and Wilson just explaining the psychic mapping of House's brain and saying, we understand his personality. It is like X and Y, and that's why he's like that. But it kind of said, this guy is flawed. He has issues, and we're going to explore them as we do all the medical procedural stuff, which also has its subverted expectations involved, and it's a twist and a play. So really, to understand Gregory House is to kind of understand the ambitions of what David Shaw was setting out to do, which was to create something that was way more complex than what had been done before. I mean, you could then argue that ER did something really complex because it showed people in a kind of realistic setting, and it was gritty and arresting, and George Clooney was doing stuff, and there was personal politics involved, and that's true. I mean, but House, and I'll contend this very, very controversially, even though it does rely on science and reason in a sense, but this is not a realistic medical procedural drama.
Yeah.
Because stuff, as we'll see in the next seasons, things just get weird and distorted. It becomes much more psychological, which I think is something we will be discussing, I think, as we go on.
Yeah, completely. The show just starts to break the form a bit more, and it focuses a lot more on people kind of trying to analyze each other's like psychology. It starts to become a bit more about there's a lot more scenes that take place in people's minds, like people telling narratives, that kind of thing. But for now, the show has been relatively grounded, although it does kind of bring in those elements in 3 stories would probably be the big one.
And also you get those weird moments where we see illness through the perspective of the patients. So it's a lot more kind of grounded in their experience, which is not necessarily something you would see in something more realistic, where you probably just see the person jerking around and flailing about, whoa, and then kind of falling down. Like, for instance, in DNR, when you see him kind of like tunneling out before he collapses on the floor and things like that.
Yeah, completely.
So I just wouldn't say it sticks to a strict realism even in season 1. It just plays with it more subtly now because it's kind of testing the waters to see whether it flies or not, I guess. And that's kind of one of the things we need to kind of get to grips with the character of Gregory House, is that he's just not a boilerplate doctor. He's much more cerebral and psychological.
I think the interesting part of House's character, like right up front, this would be why I think the character works so well. He's very much like he's got an element of Sherlock Holmes, right? As you mentioned before, that's where a lot of the play on words and the character basis comes from. So he's got, like, the reason why Holmes was so interesting is that even though he was a very subdued, like, even though he was a very, like, antisocial person who wasn't very good at interacting with people, when he was, in the flair of solving a crime, he was, he would disguise himself as people. He was, he would knock people down. He would just be like, shut up, you're wrong. He would go into these amazing, like, theories of how things worked. He was excited. He was at points very charismatic when he needed to be. And he really got people on side. And it was that performance element of Sherlock Holmes that was so interesting to watch. And then, but I'd say the big difference of, I'd say the show takes that very well and puts it into the show. But I'd say the big difference between Sherlock Holmes and House as characters is that we don't really see a lot of Holmes behind the scenes. We'll see him being bored and he entertains himself by just doing heroin, and he pretty much shuts down or comes up with silly things to do. But we never, because everything's sort of through the lens of Watson, we don't really see a lot of just Holmes sitting at home and his feelings on his life. We very much see him when he's alive in that performance element of it, in the midst of solving a crime. I have actually read all the Sherlock Holmes books, by the way, just in case anybody thought I was bluffing. But then, in terms of House, I think the reason why the show works so well is you get that performance element right. You have, you have, House is sarcastic. I was watching a bit of Kitchen Nightmares recently with Gordon Ramsay, and House very much reminds me of that. He's like there with the team, yelling, putting pressure on them, being incredibly sarcastic to everyone. And he's totally focused. Whenever, we only really see him when there's a mystery around, because that's when House is his most interesting. These medical mysteries come and they're like a puzzle. He can't help but solve it, and he will do anything to solve it. But I think what gives the show its depth is that, unlike Holmes, we do see the behind the scenes. We see him while he's alone, and we see, we have people like Wilson, characters like Wilson, who are extremely important. Obviously a separate character in and of themselves, but they're very important for the functioning of House, because Wilson is very personally invested in House. He's a good friend, and he will go and check up on House. I don't think Holmes has anyone like that, really.
Watson?
Who's as invested in, like, his... I mean, Watson kind of is, but they never have, like, a heart-to-heart, which Wilson does with House, or tries to.
Okay, right.
And so what you have with House is you have, you get the comedy element, you get the performance element. So during the cases, House is an extremely entertaining character, and that is an amazing starting point for the character, because, if you're watching the pilot episode and the character's entertaining, it gets you invested. You're like, oh, this is really fun to watch. But then what you have is, during those quieter moments when he's by himself, you see a very different person. And I think instead of just having House be kooky and crazy all the time, that you get this kind of this weird like mirror effect, where when House is by himself, he just sort of drinks, he takes drugs, he's quiet, he's just bored, he just watches the TV, he just tries to ignore people. And you see that more witty, kind of out there version of the character is actually a mask that he wears in public to hide his pain, to deflect away from serious conversations that people try to have about his conduct and the way he looks after himself and his, personal relationships and the way he treats people. There's so I think the show, the show is well written enough to, on the face of it, be a very entertaining show. But if you're looking for more, it does show you that other side of House. And but it doesn't make the two separate. It makes them interact, that you see that actually, one is a mask for the other. And it's that more lonesome, sad House, which then, as you say, like slowly starts to creep in more and more. So, you're watching the first few episodes and you're like, this is great. This is like, this is really fun. This House, he's a bit he's a bit controversial. Isn't he funny? And then you get to an episode like Detox where it's like, this guy has problems. And you start to see that more. So I think the character is really well constructed in that he can both be entertaining but incredibly solemn as well, while keeping the two coherent. Like, very good character construction on that end.
Okay. Yeah, so let's delve into that with a bit more detail. And
you dissect him a bit more.
I was going to ask you a few questions about how you kind of view House's sense of humour in this season, because I felt the humour is a massive part of how the character works, and like you said, it gets people invested because everyone's looking for that zinger and they go, oh damn, that's pretty good. Especially with the back and forth between characters, it really does play a part in framing his relationships with them. So I was looking to see whether you had anything to say about how House's humour factors into this entire series. And then we can move more towards, well, how does it frame the different relationships he has with his team? I thought maybe.
Yeah, I think that's the best entrance point, is because that's the first thing you see of House. Like, you see this possibly not in the pilot necessarily. I think House really comes alive in paternity. That's when sorry to keep slagging off the pilot, but it's like he is so more restrained in that he comes across as like a wise mentor who's sort of a bit snarky. But from paternity, there's a lot more theatrics and performance to it, and I think I think I mean a lot of it is just that a lot of his humor comes from, he's a very witty person. He's in charge. He wants the best of people. And the way he puts the team under pressure is just by making jokes. So I think that's, if you were going to like look at how has House changed from hurting his leg, I can imagine that he was very much like that before. That's just his managerial style. That's just how he composes himself. He's just a sarcastic person. It's I think the big things are the moments when he's confronted. And even though people are trying to have serious conversations about his life, the fact that the humor doesn't go away there, because that's not him trying to improve people. That's not him trying to put people down to build them up. That's just deflection. And that's the most interesting part of his character, is the total, like, just inappropriate moments of humor where it's just to deflect. I think I would keep using Detox as an example, where Wilson says, you've changed, and House is just like, well, yeah, I'm older, I get lonely,
Yeah.
My hair's graying, and then when Wilson keeps pushing him on it, then that's when he slams his cane on the desk and he says, of course I've changed, and that's like a moment of fury and rage, and that's when you see that, that's why you kind of see why the humor and deflection is such an integral part of, House's like self-defense mechanism. Like, he does not have any patience once that goes away.
Yeah.
There's a lot of rage below that character. There's a lot of sadness and regret and disappointment. And so it's from that moment where you start to see that a lot of the humor and a lot of the sarcasm isn't healthy. It's to hide this sort of bubbling dislike for himself, almost like dislike for himself and his life, which but you don't really see that at first. At first, you just think like, oh, this is a really funny guy. But I don't want to list it as like he's always being deflective for negative reasons, and
Yeah.
he's always being deflective because of the leg. Because you could put a lot of stuff down to the leg, and I think, most people would say most things that House does is because he's in pain. But I think a lot of his humor is still healthy. It's for a purpose. It's just for fun. But there are the moments when it, kind of turns and you see it as more of a as a deflective mechanism. Those are the most interesting parts of the humor.
Okay.
But
yeah.
I'd say for the most part, House is being sarcastic and silly because it entertains him.
Yeah. So, for instance, especially when looking at the team, he uses like very sardonic humor as a means to kind of put them down or say, stay in your lane, I'm the boss, and I'm much better at this than you at the moment. You have something to learn.
Yeah.
So,
But do you feel that he's like, I feel like he's quite mentory in the first season. He's putting them down, but it's, he doesn't want them to just quit. He wants them to challenge him. Do you get that feeling about his approach to the team?
Yeah, he's definitely in those cases where he's mocking them. He's mocking them from a position of, please try harder. This is serious. And if you treat this a bit like a joke, then I'm going to treat you like a joke. To an extent. It's not as extreme as that, but there's this kind of mutuality where how stupid the mistake is usually comes with an equal and opposite kind of mocking disdain for their mistake and what they've done and the reasons why. Very kind of Newtonian principle of humour when it comes to them, I guess. And so, yeah, the humour in that sense, it's all kind of melded into that kind of mentor role. Whereas you can definitely see it contrasted when he confronts Cuddy. A lot of the humour, especially in the more kind of scenes with more gravity, they always come with deflection. So when she's starting to kind of get under his skin about stuff like his role in the hospital or his life, then he does that. But then there's another mode with Cuddy where he uses humor as a way to kind of playfully chide up to authority because he doesn't like authority. And so his kind of mocking humor is not so much a kind of saying, fuck you, Cuddy, I hate everything you do, because without Cuddy, he has nothing. It's more to do with the fact that it's him reminding her that the way that he works, how he excels, is by being anarchic and saying, look, I cannot recognize your authority in some cases because otherwise it will stop me being me. And you want me to be me so I can get things done.
Which is an admission that Cuddy makes often.
Yeah. Like she always acknowledges that, but that's what the humor is about. That's what the back and forth is about. She's having to remind him, there are constraints, House, and I will remind you of those constraints. And on the other hand, House is saying, I need to say, fuck your constraints. I have to do this, otherwise I don't function as a medic. I have to question authority. I have to question assumptions. I have to question the conventional wisdom. And that's one reason. And I think the other fact is there's a dependency relationship between House and Cuddy that I think stems back a bit further than we know at the moment. Where they've had something in the past, but also it's a recognition that Cuddy had some role in the fact that his leg is the way it is. We don't know whether House really knows that, so I don't know how strong that idea is, where he uses dismissive jokes against her. But
yeah, because all we know that in 3 stories, we know that she was his leading physician, right?
yeah. So we never really 100% know that. So that's my theory, not necessarily backed up with any sort of real concrete evidence. And then the other fact is, you see Cuddy can give as good as she gets because she can say stuff. So, for instance, in the pilot, funnily enough, House says, there's philosopher Jagger said you can't always get what you want. Then Cuddy comes back, at the end of the episode, I've read up on this philosopher Jagger, and he says if you try sometimes you get what you need, and that kind of frames some of the plot constraints of the season, because now he has to do clinic duties, so we get those clinic bits in, and it's also a way of framing the relationship between House and Cuddy, because she's the head of the hospital per se, head of medicine, and he's kind of a subordinate as a head of diagnostic medicine. So
Completely.
yeah.
Well, it does also frame House's relationship with his own life as well.
Yeah.
Beyond his relationship with Cuddy, it's we see many times House being in regret of the way of the way his life has turned out, especially with his leg. His leg seems to be pretty much the boundary to his happiness in a way. I think in Maternity, when he goes and watches that lacrosse game and you see him reminiscing, sort of daydreaming almost after the game, sort of you assume he's just sort of reminiscing about a past when he was able to do things like that. And the fact of the matter is that, he will never be able to do that again. But so he can't get what he wants, but the need is, but can you be happy in the life that you have now? So it's for just using the lyrics of a song as a kind of a silly little confrontation between the two, it does actually sum up a lot of the themes in House's actual arc over the entire show.
Yeah, wants and needs is a good way of thinking about some of the things that House confronts in his life. So, does he want the pills, or does he need the pills to function? Is he just wanting to use the pills as a means to create a barrier between himself and the reality, in a way, by numbing the pain? Or is it a need in the sense that he needs them to function because otherwise the pain is crippling? And really, the answer is so blurred. The dichotomy is good to think with because it shows how blurred that is for the character. He wants the pills. He has an addiction. And in a way, he needs the pills because he's in pain. Those things are in conflict. And then what does pain mean? Is it something that requires does that justify the need? Is it the physical pain that he's using the pills for, or is it a mental reason, or is it a mixture of both? And again, that gets blurred together. There are a lot of these weird ambiguities that kind of crop up about his life. He wants a relationship, but is that the thing he needs? Is he in a position of growth to do that?
Yeah, and a lot of the conflict as well is from even House doesn't know what he wants or needs.
Yeah.
So that there are times when House could pretty easily secure what he seemingly wants, as you say, a relationship, and then we, find out later that he, is getting in the way of that for reasons that are pretty much unknown at the moment. But I think they're, it's it's almost like he. I mean, you could argue that maybe he gets off on the self-destruction Like, I mean, look at his relationship with Wilson, right? They seem to have a very, they have a very good relationship, and House doesn't have a lot of friends, but, and you can see the moments where House really lets Wilson in, like, Wilson wants to come over to House's for Christmas because his marriage isn't going very well. And they seemingly, through the montage we see, they have a very lovely day. They have a very lovely, like, little Chinese meal, and then Cameron wants to be in a relationship with him. And, even though he goes on the date, he doesn't really give it a chance. And, even though he could have Wilson over and have a nice time all the time, he seems to be like, constantly dismissing that. You really start to see, like, there's this theme of pain throughout it, whether it's physical or emotional pain or a kind of existential pain. But then you also see House causing his own pain. And it really starts to make you question how, whether or not House does want to get better, or maybe he kind of gets off on that. Like, does he enjoy being miserable? Does he get something from it? The show does later go on to kind of explain that there's an idea that House thinks his greatness comes from his pain, which is a nice way of explaining it. We don't know that yet, but it's one of those elements of, the show setting something up, which it then goes on to pay off later.
Yeah, and
But,
I would say that's a very romantic notion of House as well, in the sense that, without his pain, he cannot be the hero, as it were.
yeah, but it's stupid as well, and people tell him it's stupid.
Yeah.
Because he was great. Well, I mean, because the irony is, he was a great doctor before the leg.
Yeah.
He can obviously be a great doctor when he's happy, but he just, I guess he's so consumed by living a life of pain that now he thinks it makes him great. It makes him more focused. I mean, maybe he has become a better doctor, but then there's the question of, is it worth it? And, I think based on what I've know from House and the fact that, he does really, he really loves, his personal relationships as much as he likes to deflect and pretend they don't matter. Like, you see when Cameron leaves during the Vogler arc, when she gets fired, he spends a whole episode trying to get her back. And I don't think that's just because he thinks she's a great doctor. There's lots of great doctors out there. I think it's because, he values her. And so House hides how much he values people. House totally gets in the way of his own self-interest all the time, which, once again, is a great thing because it allows for House to always be stuck in a rut. But it gives an explanation for it. So I guess for the convenience of the showrunners, it's like they can constantly have this ongoing arc of his House going to get better, and then he sabotages himself. And it's interesting to watch because it's tragic, and it isn't that common in TV shows, especially like this one. But it's it's very horrible to watch someone stuck in that rut, and it's a very realistic story. Like, people frequently don't improve their lives when they could.
Yeah. And the other thing it also brings up to question is that you have this kind of really powerful idea of House as being someone with like immense willpower and discipline, especially when dealing with cases.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, all of this stuff happens. He has these opportunities, and then they all kind of fall away because of his own actions. And you think to yourself, okay, there are two like things going on. Either he's consciously sabotaging his chances for something approaching a kind of more emotionally satisfying life, that it's a conscious, willful decision, or actually House is more of an animal of his habits than he lets on, that he's kind of more subject to his habitual behaviors than we see. I mean, you could easily make that argument by saying he's a drug addict. Of course it's habitual. There you go.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's that easy to see. And it just, those two kind of sides of him that just feel so at odds, but seem also so... it also makes sense for them to be together. So it's a... and then from that it creates this character that, to quote quite an oft interesting character a description of Byron, mad, bad, and dangerous to know. He's a Byronic hero, I guess.
That's Byron the poet.
Yeah, Byronic hero. Yeah, but the kind of name, the type of character is named after Lord Byron, because of his persona and some of the characters in his own writing. And as I'm reading, and I'll be honest, I am reading, and I think this captures it right, because the critic and historian, I think Lord Macaulay, who did like Histories of England, if I remember correctly, or Histories of Britain, I can't remember off the top of my head, he says, the character of the Byronic hero stereotype is a man proud, moody, cynical, with a defiance on his brow and misery in his heart, a scorner of his kind, implacable in revenge, yet capable of deep and strong affection. I mean, that seems like a very good fit for House.
Yeah,
if you ask me.
And also I think that you said this really early in the podcast, which I think was one of the best like ways to give a good focus on how to view House. Is you said like he's an anarchist, not a nihilist.
Yeah,
because I think I do get the sense that some people who watch the show think the House is cool because he doesn't care about anything, whereas, as you said, like from your reading and even that reading of the like Byronic archetype, it's a person who is, House doesn't not care about anything. He has values. He's capable of this very deep emotional reflection on the world. But it just, it's a negative reflection on the world. He does, his underlying mantra is everybody lies. He has a very, negative outlook, but that doesn't mean that his, outlook is, nihilistic or, screw everyone.
Yeah.
It very much like he frequently has moments where he cares about people. He goes out of his way to help clinic patients. He goes out of his way to help regular patients. Like the episode Control is probably the best example I can think of. Like there are lots of episodes where he talks and convinces the patient of a treatment. But Control is the only one where he goes to a woman who has been self-harming to the point where she's destroyed her own heart and she needs a heart transplant, but they can't give her a heart transplant, if she has any like evidence of mental health problems through self-harming. And House just says to her, I will put my medical license on the line if you tell me that, your life is worth living. And eventually she tells him that, and he goes away and he lies for her, even when he's under extreme scrutiny from Vogler at the time.
Yeah.
Like, perfect example of House doing something because he believes it to be right.
There's a moral compass to his thinking and decision making.
Yeah, because and a lot of even characters in the show accuse him of just doing stuff to screw with people, but these are these moments where he has real connections with patients never happen around anyone, and that's what I find quite funny. It's just that even his friends don't understand him, because Wilson never sees that moment where he goes to the woman's room and says, I'll lie for you if you need this heart. Wilson never finds out about that, so Wilson will never know that House actually had a positive interaction. Wilson will be like, damn, that guy doesn't know how to connect with people. It's like, he's connecting with this woman right here. You just didn't see it.
Yeah.
Because he's so good at compartmentalizing his life and keeping parts of it secret from everyone else.
Yeah, and I think the other thing to take into consideration that Wilson did kind of see the hesitancy that House had sometimes during that actual scene where he was in the transplant board.
Yeah.
And it seemed to me like Wilson's reaction to that was one of, you might be doing something right, but, didn't really understand the rationale. And I guess that might, like you say, it means that people aren't necessarily reading the full story, but they'll trust him in his judgment, but they never really see the underlying moral impetus necessarily for that decision. And I think that's something that comes across, that we see as privileged access as viewers It's very interesting.
Completely. And that's because House isn't working to a strict code as well. You slowly work out what his ethical code is by watching it, but it's not like you see other doctors like in DNR. There's the opposing doctor Marty Hamilton. He's very much like, what the patient wants is always right, like really pretty much the Hippocratic Oath personified, which House kind of dismisses the Hippocratic Oath because House isn't running on another, House isn't running on anyone else's like ethical system. He's running on his own. And that's why House sometimes comes across as inconsistent. But I think if you watch it and really pay attention, there's an underlying ethical code there. Sometimes it's based on how he's feeling. Sometimes it's based on, just whether or not he thinks people deserve it. It's anarchic. It's very much like sometimes emotionally based. Sometimes it's, based on things that he believes to be right, like keeping people alive. But there's a system there. And I think that's how most people's morals work as well. Like, I would say, like, I'm probably more of an emotivist than I'd like to think. I don't exactly have a stringent system of what crimes I think are worse. It's just how I feel about them at the time. And I think a lot of people work like that. So it's a very... it's an ethical system that I can attach to because I get where it's coming from.
Yeah.
And I think that's how most people think, and I think most people do it. It's like, it would be better than if House was, it'd be better than if House had like strict rules that he always had to follow. Like House isn't like that. He's following rules, but they're flexible and they're dynamic, like most people's moral systems.
Yeah, but I guess the thing to also take into consideration is that him chiding or breaking or completely or bending those moral strictures that we kind of hold ourselves to in more formal situations makes for a compelling watching experience. When he decides, I'm going to stab this patient with a syringe of this, like, chemical cocktail to see if they're going to, like, force into an attack so that I can then take a sample of their urine so that I could prove my case. He didn't ask for consent. He just did it because he thought it was the right thing to do. He felt an attachment towards Stacy that also implicated his... it kind of made the decision even more compelling to him. But it's when it's like, oh, he's gone against the consent principle. Oh my God. Yeah, that's obviously going to create really good drama. Because you're expecting, well, their actions mean there are consequences, and sometimes there are consequences, sometimes there are not, in terms of negative ones. But it kind of... once he breaks the rules, and if there is a positive outcome, then it's like, okay, fine. You broke the rules. You broke the rules to get a good thing. Fine. And then the show goes on. Whereas maybe in the real world, if someone did that, even with the positive outcome, he or she would still be looking at having their medical license revoked.
Absolutely.
So it's an interesting one.
One thing, because I think we probably should talk about. We've kind of gone into House's relationship with Wilson and Cameron, but we should probably focus on Stacy's. It is a very underlying mystery.
Yes, it is
throughout the whole thing, but throughout the whole first series. But one thing I liked, which I noticed in the final episode of season 1, which we're talking about on Monday, but we kind of want to have a fully fledged idea of what House is like during season 1, so we have to talk about that episode as well. There's this constant theme of has House changed? There's this throughout the first series, and it's what I found quite interesting is that it's Wilson who and the team are very interested in this. The team will ask people, has House always been like this, and they try and theorize how he might have changed. But we actually see two of the people who knew House before the incident who actually ask him, talk to him about the way he's changed. There's Wilson, who in Detox actually confronts House and says, "You've changed. You're miserable." And, House then says, "Yeah, of course I've changed." They have that big argument.
Yeah.
And then in the last episode, Honeymoon, Cameron asks Stacy, was House the same before the leg incident? And she says, yeah, he pretty much was. And what I found interesting when watching that, I was like, well, that seems pretty incoherent. Like, I didn't know whether or not that was the writers just, coming up with interesting answers depending on what they wanted. But when I was thinking about it further, I thought what was interesting about that was that Wilson has obviously been around House throughout the entire process, the entire 5 years. He's seen him, reach lower and lower points in his life. But Stacy has only been around House, during the incident. Then they broke up. She went away for 5 years, and now she's returned. And if you watch the scenes with House, like House is kind of being quite nice to Stacy. They have, it can be a bit standoffish, but he's being charming. He wants to talk with her. He's openly talking about his feelings. He's like, people are telling me to stay away from you because they feel that, I might still have feelings for you. And eventually she does open up that she has feelings, and so does he. And they have many heart-to-hearts, and they even share a little kiss, even though it's a kiss on the cheek. But I think that when Stacy answers that question, what's interesting, and it fits in with this whole, House is so good at hiding himself that people only see him in different contexts. So like, Foreman knows a different House than Wilson knows, who knows a different House than Stacy knows. And so I think Stacy's saying that because she doesn't actually know the new House that much. She's kind of popped up. House is acting pretty much as he always is. Sure, he's a bit grumpier because he's got the leg, and, he might be acting a bit weird because of the circumstances. So when she's like, no, he was always pretty much the same, I don't think that Stacy actually has an accurate read on that. And I think that's quite an interesting answer. And if it's done on purpose to show that, Stacy is possibly misinformed about the way House is, I think it's interesting because you have two people who know him very well saying very conflicting things about how his leg has changed him.
Yeah.
I thought that was quite interesting to add to, like, everyone has a subjective view of House because of the way he compartmentalizes his life, but also kind of quite in a way quite sweet that, Wilson has been there picking up the total wreckage of House's life over the last 5 years, whereas Stacy turns up and House kind of becomes his old self again. And that's a very sweet element to that relationship, to the degree that, Stacy doesn't even realize that he's changed because he, it's like when she returns, she kind of brings him back to life. Something very heartbreaking about that, and very nice and very romantic, which is something that you don't really see the romantic element of House. Like, there's an entire Hamron plot line where he keeps telling Hamron that he's not interested in a romantic relationship, and then Stacy comes in and he's back again. He's that romantic guy that she knew 5 years ago, and even Cameron notices it. She says, wow, I thought you couldn't ever love anyone, but it turns out that you just don't love me.
Yeah.
And she's she's very sad about it, but she's also like, it's good. I'm glad that you're able to feel that.
And that's the really interesting thing about this entire season is, at first you think everyone's got a more or less an objective view of House, right?
Yeah.
That, I mean, it's a trick of the mind for us as viewers. We think like all the characters like interchange information kind of about the character, that like they're all on the same page about who he is and what he does and whatever. But you find towards the end of the season, people start coming to very different conclusions about who they think House is and why they think that way. And you think, okay, right, I see. So, Stacy sees House in a particular way, but mainly because he's able to easily become very emotionally intimate with her in the sense of talking to him about feelings. And then you see Wilson, on the other hand, like you say, his perspective is completely different. He's seen a continual decline, as you said, and a habituation of his misery. And then Cameron has a different perspective altogether, where she thought that, yeah, he's miserable. And maybe it's the fact she thought rejection of me was a rejection of everyone. But really, not so, just a rejection of her. Which is quite funny. Although sad.
But that might not be a rejection of her because it's her. It's, you know, even Stacy says to House, you know, you were the one. And I think House agrees with that. So I don't think it's like, you know, that Cameron wouldn't be great for House to date. It's just that, you know, she's not Stacy. You know, everyone fails because they're not Stacy.
Tell that to the fanfic people, man. Jeez.
Well, absolutely. I mean, you know, sadly, not a lot of stories about House and Stacy in love, even though it's a very tragic love story. It's very nice. It's very, you know, and the way the first season ends with this, kind of this very interesting cliffhanger of, you know, Stacy's coming back to the hospital. They have some history. You know, what's going to happen? And it's, but you know, you have to always be like, well, for anything to work out, you know, Mark, her new husband, has to get screwed over in some way. And there's something very mature about that. It's, you know, these people are maybe about to start having an affair, and it's like, well, you know, because you like Stacy and House together, you're like, well, I guess that's good, but you know, then you have to be like, well, why do I think it's good? You know, obviously she's happy with Mark. Like, this is terrible. Why am I thinking this? Like, you know, it really makes you not think so simplistically about they're meant to be and screw Mark. You know, he's a nice guy. He's a good person. You know, he hasn't walked out on Stacy. He's, you know, they've clearly fallen in love. And it's like, just because we haven't seen their years together doesn't mean that it's any less important. It's a very nice show for that. It handles relationships in a very mature way.
And I guess the one thing you see is that the introduction of Stacy, and towards the end you see House tries to like regress back into the past, as it were, as if to say, look, maybe I can walk again. Maybe I can eliminate that stain upon his life. I guess he would see it as a stain. Obviously, it's a disability in the round, and that comes with a load of meanings in and of themselves. But for him, he sees it as a mark of the end of a relationship, the destruction of trust between Stacy and House. And so you see in like the spoiler alert, you see in that final shot of the honeymoon episode, him trying to see if he can walk. He drinks some bourbon and then tries to walk and fails, and then struggles and is in pain, and then goes back to his habits.
Yeah. He wants improvement, but he can't have that, so he goes back to what he needs, which is Vicodin and whiskey.
Well, we don't know. This is the thing. Wants and needs, not so clear cut, are they?
No, absolutely. I do love that last shot. It really does.
We'll leave that for the episode where we do it.
Totally. But that last moment, you know, CGI aside.
No, come on, let's not spoil it, because I really want to talk about it in the next episode.
that last moment is it's like, it's House, you know, he's, as you say, his old life has come back to him, and he's like, oh, let me try and be better, and he instantly fails and just goes back to his old habits. It's extremely sad. And in a way it's interesting, because it's like, it's a very mature way to handle character growth. Like, for a moment, House had hope, and then it went away, and then, you know, he's sitting around just, you know, drinking and taking pills again, so nothing's really changed. But, you know, it took the entire season for us to see House kind of want to change and want to get better. And it's small, it's very minor. We spent most of the season just finding out who House is, with the most of that realization coming towards the tail end of the series. In 3 Stories and Honeymoon. But, you know, even the fact that House stands up and tries to take a step, that says a lot, I think. And it's not much, but you know, compared to what House is usually like, it's, you know, it's an astounding amount of character growth for him.
Yeah. Just a little tiny teensy bit of hope.
Yes.
Followed by an enormous dollop of despair.
Yeah, which is pretty much the cycle of the show, but I think that's like, but that's been done on purpose. I don't think it's just a lazy way to keep House in one place. I think you know, it's very reflective of someone with an actual problem. It's like, you know, somebody who's got a drug problem, you know, they don't just decide to go to rehab and they're fine. Like, people relapse many times, sometimes for years. And I think that's what the show encapsulates. It's that, you know, just because you do something and fail over and over and over again doesn't mean that you're failing in the long run.
But yeah, I think that's a good point which to end. I mean, this whole summary of House throughout season 1 does end on that note, and then it raises the question of whether he's just going to be the same old House around Stacy as he has been to everybody the past 5 years, the House that Stacy doesn't know, or is he going to try harder? Is he going to try and change, or even try and regress?
Completely. And it's the you know, House's arc ends very interestingly there. There's room for hope, but we're still with that same guy who's struggling. And you know, and I'd say overall the first season's arc is more discovery than development, which of course is usually the case with a first season. But some shows do, you know, might have given us more information quicker and then tried to develop him. But I really like how much of a slow burn it is, because House's very character is, you know, deflection and hiding information about him. And in a way, that's how the show works. We slowly eke out these small details about him. And I like that. And I think, you know, the rest of the cast and, you know, the interest of the medical mysteries and the great writing are enough to then carry everything forward, even though there's not much development going on. But, you know, by the end of the first season, you do know House pretty well. You see the inconsistencies, you see the flaws, and it's a fantastic, like, character study in that first season. And as I say, had the first season ended, I would have watched that and been like, wow, what a great character. Like, even though we only got one season, I understand that guy. And but we have lots of seasons, so I'm, you know, very much looking forward to continuing to discuss how they develop him and the rest of the team.
All right. Well, sounds like a good point to end.
Excellent. And I do you agree with that? Are you just excited to see where it goes?
Yeah, of course I am. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing this podcast. I'd just be like, "Yep, that's that."
It's a good
that's
point,
all, folks. You know.
Well,
my silence was tacit agreement.
As Gaz says, probably a good place to leave it. So, thanks for joining us for this character analysis of Gregory House throughout season 1. Maybe you agree with some of the points we have. Maybe you have, you know, disagreements, or maybe you have, you know, further details. We'd love to hear from you. So you can always get in touch with us at House MD Cast, or you can find us on Facebook for Differential Diagnosis, a House MD podcast. Or but yeah, we want to know your thoughts, want to know your feelings on these things, you know, because House is a multifaceted character, so he should have multifaceted interpretations from as many people as possible. But
Indeed,
I thoroughly enjoyed discussing that with you, Gaz. It's good to like get all of that in one place rather than spread across our observations throughout 22 episodes.
Definitely. I think there'll be plenty more. I think we'll do another one of these episodes once we get to the end of season 2. So stay tuned for that. And you'll see we'll probably be doing those kind of team ones as well towards the end of the episode, just so that we can kind of keep track of those same themes. And I'm really looking forward to looking at season 2 as we approach that.
Completely. It's but yeah, join us this Monday as we look at Honeymoon, the final episode of
Dun, dun, dun.
of House MD season 1. It's not going to be the final episode of Differential Diagnosis Season 1, because we're then going to do another DDXtra next week and a character and then a full series summary. So we got a few weeks to go until we take our break before we go into Season 2. But the fact that we are finally summing up Gregory House as a character for Season 1 is very exciting. I'm very glad that not only did we get to have this conversation, but we even got here. So thank you very much for joining us, and we hope you enjoyed it, and we can't wait to see you on Monday for even more differential diagnosing. Zing.
Zing, 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 zing.
I thought
you were gonna do like a crazy frog thing then.
Well, thank you. But yes, see you on Monday, guys.
See ya.